The rain had been falling since early evening, the kind that turns city lights into blurry streaks and makes everyone walk faster with their heads down. I was standing outside a small convenience store, digging through my wallet, already irritated after a long day at work. My phone battery was dying, my ride was late, and all I wanted was to get home, eat something warm, and forget the stress of the day. That's when I noticed him. He was sitting near the entrance, wrapped in an old blanket that looked too thin to fight the cold. His shoes were worn out, his beard messy, and beside him sat a small cardboard sign that simply read, "Anything helps. God bless." I saw him the moment I walked in, but like most people, I pretended not to notice. It felt easier that way. When I came back out with my coffee and snacks, he gently spoke, his voice quiet but clear. He asked if I could spare a little money for food. It wasn't aggressive or desperate, just calm, almost polite. I froze for a second. I remember thinking about all the stories I had heard. People saying some beggars aren't honest, people warning not to encourage street begging, people saying it's better to donate to charities instead. My mind ran through every excuse it could find in just a few seconds. I looked at him, then quickly looked away. I told him I didn't have any cash and started walking toward my car, even though there were a few crumpled bills sitting right in my wallet. As I walked away, I felt something strange in my chest, like a small weight I couldn't shake off. I tried to convince myself that I had done nothing wrong. After all, refusing to give money to a beggar is something many people do every day. Some say it's about safety. Others say it's about principle. Some people genuinely can't afford to help, while others just don't feel comfortable giving. I kept repeating those thoughts in my head as I sat inside my car, watching the rain hit the windshield. For a moment, I almost started the engine and drove off. But something made me glance back toward the store entrance. He was still there, sitting quietly, not calling out to anyone else. People walked past him, some ignoring him completely, some glancing for a split second before looking away. There was something about how still he sat, like he had already accepted that most people wouldn't stop. I noticed his hands were trembling slightly from the cold. That image stuck with me longer than I expected. I don't know why, but it made me think about how easy it is to judge someone without knowing their story. We often see a beggar and instantly create assumptions. We imagine choices, mistakes, or laziness without ever understanding what events could have led them there. I shook my head, trying to snap out of it, telling myself I was overthinking. I reminded myself that I had my own problems, my own responsibilities, my own bills waiting at home. Life is expensive, and helping everyone is impossible. That's what I told myself as I finally started the car. The engine hummed, the heater slowly warming the freezing air inside. But just as I was about to pull out of the parking lot, something unexpected happened. A woman rushed toward the store entrance, clearly upset, looking around frantically as if she had lost something important. She stopped right in front of the man and started talking to him. I couldn't hear their conversation through the rain and the closed windows, but I could see her body language. She looked worried. He pointed somewhere down the street, and she suddenly ran in that direction without even stepping inside the store. Curiosity kept me parked there longer than I planned. I watched as the man slowly adjusted his blanket and coughed into his sleeve. A few seconds later, he reached into a small plastic bag beside him and pulled out what looked like a sandwich, but instead of eating it, he placed it carefully next to another person who had quietly sat down near him. Someone I hadn't even noticed before. That person looked even weaker, barely moving, almost invisible to everyone rushing past. The man patted their shoulder gently, like he was comforting them, even though he clearly had very little himself. Something about that moment hit me hard. Here was someone asking strangers for money, someone most people would ignore or judge, and yet he was still willing to share the little food he had. It made me question my own actions just minutes earlier. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, feeling a mix of guilt and confusion. Why did I assume he didn't deserve help? Why did I create a story about him without knowing anything about his life? These thoughts kept spinning in my mind as the rain continued pouring down. Then my phone buzzed with a low battery warning, snapping me back to reality. I sighed, knowing I should just leave before my car stalled or my phone completely died. I put the car into reverse, ready to back out of the parking space. But just as I began to move, I noticed flashing lights reflecting off the wet pavement. A police car slowly pulled into the lot and stopped near the store entrance. My heart skipped for a moment. 2 officers stepped out and walked toward the man. I couldn't tell if they were there to help him or remove him. He didn't move. He just looked up calmly as they approached. I don't know why, but I suddenly felt nervous, like I was about to witness something important. The officers started speaking to him, and one of them crouched down to his level. Their conversation seemed serious but not aggressive. A small crowd began forming near the entrance, people pretending to check their phones while clearly watching what was happening. I leaned forward slightly, trying to understand the situation. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out something that looked like an old photograph. He handed it to one of the officers, and as the officer looked at it, his expression changed instantly. He looked shocked, almost emotional. At that exact moment, the store manager rushed outside, pointing toward the street and saying something loudly. One of the officers turned quickly, speaking into his radio, while the other continued staring at the photograph in silence. The man sitting on the ground slowly lowered his head, like he already knew what was coming next. My heart started beating faster, and without even realizing it, I turned off my car engine completely, unable to leave. What I witnessed in the next few minutes would completely change the way I see kindness, judgment, and the simple act of refusing to help someone in need. But before I could fully understand what was happening, one of the officers suddenly turned toward the parking lot and pointed directly at my car. For a second, I honestly thought I was imagining it. The officer's finger was clearly pointed toward my car, and his eyes locked onto me like he was certain I had something to do with whatever was unfolding. My stomach tightened. I hadn't broken any rules. I hadn't even stepped out of my vehicle. Still, something about the situation made my hands feel cold against the steering wheel. I glanced around, half expecting another car behind me, but the parking lot was nearly empty except for mine. The officer said something to his partner and then slowly started walking in my direction, his shoes splashing through the shallow puddles forming on the pavement. I debated leaving. The thought crossed my mind more than once. I could easily pull out and drive away and maybe they wouldn't bother chasing me. But another part of me, the same part that had kept me parked there watching everything, wouldn't let me move. The officer finally reached my window and gestured for me to roll it down. I hesitated for a split second before lowering it just enough to hear him over the sound of the rain. He asked if I had been parked there long and whether I had noticed anything unusual around the store entrance. His tone wasn't accusing, but it was serious enough to make my heart pound faster. I told him the truth. I said I had just come out of the store, saw the man sitting there, and stayed in my car for a few minutes before noticing the officers arrive. He studied my face carefully, like he was measuring every word I said. Then he asked something that caught me off guard. He asked if the man had spoken to me or tried to give me anything. The question confused me. I shook my head and said he had only asked for money, and I had walked away. The officer nodded slowly, glancing back toward his partner, who was still crouched beside the man holding the photograph. The officer standing near me thanked me for cooperating but didn't walk away right away. Instead, he looked back toward the entrance again and I followed his gaze. The scene felt tense but strangely quiet. The small crowd had grown slightly, though people kept their distance, pretending not to stare while clearly paying attention to every movement. The second officer was now speaking into a radio while still holding the photograph. The man on the ground remained calm, almost too calm, like he had accepted whatever was about to happen long before this moment. The officer at my window finally stepped back and returned to his partner. I could see them talking but I couldn't hear their words. The rain softened slightly, making it easier to catch pieces of their expressions. One officer looked concerned, while the other seemed puzzled, occasionally glancing at the man and then at the photograph again. My curiosity grew stronger by the second. I kept wondering what could be so important about an old photo that it changed an officer's reaction that quickly. As I sat there, my mind drifted back to the few seconds I had interacted with the man earlier. I replayed his voice in my head. It had sounded tired but respectful. There was no pressure, no anger, no frustration when I refused him. Just a simple nod and a quiet, "Have a good evening." The memory made me feel uneasy. Most people expect rejection when asking strangers for help, but there had been something different about his reaction. It felt like he had already accepted that people would walk away before they even reached for their wallets. A sudden movement near the entrance pulled me back to the present. The woman who had rushed off earlier was returning, but she wasn't alone this time. She was with a younger boy, maybe around 10 or 11 years old, holding tightly onto her arm. The boy looked nervous, scanning the area like he was searching for someone. When they reached the officers, the woman started speaking quickly, pointing toward the man sitting under the blanket. The boy's eyes followed her finger, and the moment he saw the man, his expression changed instantly. His grip on the woman's arm loosened, and he took a small step forward, like he recognized him. The officers exchanged glances again. One of them gently spoke to the woman while the other stood up and helped the man rise slightly, though he still remained seated on the ground. The photograph was passed back into the man's hands, and he held it carefully, almost protectively, pressing it against his chest for a brief moment. I leaned forward in my seat trying to see what was on the picture, but the distance and the dim store lights made it impossible. The wind picked up, pushing rain against the glass of my car harder than before. The entire moment felt surreal, like time had slowed down. The boy suddenly stepped closer to the man, stopping just a few feet away. He stared at him quietly, as if he was trying to confirm something he couldn't fully believe. The man looked up at him, and for the first time since I noticed him, I saw his expression shift. His calm face softened, and his eyes widened slightly with what looked like surprise mixed with emotion he was trying hard to hide. The woman placed her hand on the boy's shoulder, saying something softly that I couldn't hear. The officer stepped back just enough to give them space but remained close enough to watch carefully. A few people from the crowd began whispering to each other, clearly curious about what was unfolding. I noticed the store manager standing near the door, arms crossed, looking both worried and impatient, glancing between the officers and the growing group of onlookers. I realized I was holding my breath without noticing. Something about this entire situation felt bigger than a simple encounter between officers and someone asking for money. There was history here, connections, pieces of a story that none of us watching could fully understand yet. The rain continued falling, creating a steady background rhythm that made the silence between their movements feel even heavier. The boy slowly took another step forward, now close enough that the man could reach out if he wanted to. The man's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the photograph again, his eyes never leaving the boy's face. One of the officers said something quietly into his radio again, his voice low and controlled, but his eyes stayed fixed on the interaction happening in front of him. I felt an urge to step out of my car to get closer to understand what was going on, but I stayed frozen in my seat. My earlier decision to ignore the man replayed in my mind again, growing louder with every passing second. I wondered if I had just witnessed the beginning of something important or if I had already missed a chance to be part of something meaningful. Then, just as the boy opened his mouth like he was about to speak, the distant sound of another siren echoed through the wet streets, growing louder as it approached the parking lot, and every person standing near the store entrance turned their attention toward the flashing lights coming closer. The second siren grew louder until another vehicle pulled into the parking lot, its flashing lights reflecting off the rain-soaked ground and the glass windows of the store. The atmosphere shifted instantly. People who had been pretending not to stare now stepped back even farther, whispering and pulling out their phones, though most kept them lowered as if unsure whether they should record or just watch. I stayed inside my car, but my attention was locked on the entrance, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Two more officers stepped out of the vehicle, moving quickly but not aggressively. One of them carried what looked like a small medical bag, while the other scanned the area, observing everyone standing nearby. The woman tightened her grip on the boy's shoulder, guiding him slightly behind her as the officers approached. The man sitting on the ground didn't move much, but I noticed his shoulders stiffened slightly, like he was bracing himself for something familiar, something he had faced before. The officer who had spoken to me earlier walked toward the new arrivals and began explaining the situation. Their conversation was quiet, but their expressions showed concern mixed with uncertainty. Meanwhile, the officer who had been holding the photograph earlier spoke gently to the man, asking him a few questions. The man nodded slowly, occasionally glancing toward the boy and the woman. Every time he looked at them, there was a mixture of hope and hesitation in his eyes, like he was unsure whether he was allowed to feel anything at all. The boy peeked out from behind the woman again. He stared at the man with a focus that seemed too intense for someone his age. His face carried confusion, curiosity, and something deeper, something that suggested recognition but also fear of being wrong. The woman whispered something to him, and he nodded slightly, though he didn't step forward again. I could see her eyes glistening under the store lights, her expression filled with worry and emotional tension she was trying hard to control. The officer with the medical bag knelt beside the man and asked if he was feeling all right. The man responded quietly, gesturing that he was fine, though his coughing returned briefly, forcing him to pull the thin blanket tighter around himself. The officer offered him a bottle of water, which he accepted with a small nod of appreciation. Even from a distance, it was clear he wasn't comfortable being the center of attention, especially with so many strangers watching. As this unfolded, my mind kept replaying the moment when the officer had asked me if the man tried to give me anything. The question lingered like a puzzle piece that didn't fit yet. I started wondering if the photograph had something to do with that. Maybe the man had been trying to show it to people. Maybe he had been searching for someone, not just asking for spare money. The thought made my chest tighten again, reminding me how quickly I had walked away without even making eye contact for more than a second. The store manager stepped closer to the officers, clearly eager to say something. He spoke with quick hand movements, pointing toward the entrance and occasionally toward the small crowd. His face showed concern, but also frustration, like he was worried about business, customers, or possible complaints. One of the officers nodded politely while trying to keep his focus on the man and the woman. It was clear that multiple worries were colliding in that small space: public safety, human compassion, personal history, and unanswered questions. Rain continued falling, though softer now, turning the parking lot into a mirror reflecting every flashing light and movement. The crowd shifted slightly as a few more people arrived, some stepping out of cars just to watch what was happening. I noticed how quickly situations like this attract attention, yet how rarely people truly understand the story behind them. Most would probably assume it was just another encounter between law enforcement and someone experiencing homelessness, another moment that would fade into memory once they drove away. The officer who had first approached my car suddenly turned toward the woman and asked if she recognized the man. She hesitated before answering, glancing down at the boy as if seeking silent confirmation. Her voice was low, but her body language suggested she was struggling to explain something complicated, something emotional. The officer listened carefully, occasionally asking gentle follow-up questions. The boy watched their conversation closely, his eyes shifting between the woman and the man, as if he was trying to piece together a story he had only heard fragments of. Meanwhile, the man slowly opened his hand, revealing the photograph again. This time, he looked at it longer, his fingers tracing the edges carefully, almost like he was afraid it might disappear if he let go. He spoke softly to the officer beside him, his voice barely visible through the movement of his lips. The officer leaned closer to hear him, his expression gradually shifting from professional focus to something more personal, almost empathetic. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter without realizing it. I felt like I was watching a moment that was deeply personal for strangers whose lives had somehow crossed paths in front of me. The earlier guilt I felt had now mixed with curiosity and a strange sense of responsibility, even though I had no real connection to any of them. I wondered how many times this man had sat outside stores, ignored by people like me, carrying that same photograph, waiting for a moment that might never come. The woman suddenly crouched down slightly, bringing herself closer to the man's eye level. She spoke to him in a softer tone, her voice trembling just enough to show how emotional the moment had become. The boy stepped forward again, standing beside her this time instead of hiding behind her. The man looked at both of them, his eyes filled with a mixture of recognition and disbelief that he seemed almost afraid to express out loud. Behind them, one of the officers spoke into his radio again, his voice calm but urgent enough to suggest that more information was being requested or confirmed. The other officer scanned the crowd, possibly making sure the situation remained peaceful and controlled. The store manager had stepped back toward the entrance, watching quietly now, as if realizing this moment was bigger than store policies or customer complaints. The wind carried a chill through the parking lot, making the blanket around the man flutter slightly. He tightened his grip on it, still holding the photograph close. The boy's gaze remained fixed on him, his expression slowly shifting as if memories or stories he had heard were beginning to connect with the person sitting in front of him. The woman placed her hand gently on the boy's back, steadying him, though she herself looked like she was struggling to stay composed. I noticed the officer with the medical bag checking something on a small device, possibly running a routine health check or noting observations. The first officer crossed his arms, looking between the man, the woman, and the boy, clearly aware that whatever connection existed between them was unfolding slowly, layer by layer. Then, just as the man took a deeper breath like he was about to speak directly to the boy, one of the officers received a message through his radio that made his expression turn serious again, and he immediately stepped forward, placing a gentle but firm hand on the man's shoulder, pausing the moment before a single word could be spoken. The officer's hand resting on the man's shoulder immediately shifted the mood. It wasn't rough or aggressive, but it was enough to stop whatever the man was about to say. The silence that followed felt heavier than the rain still falling around them. The boy looked confused, glancing between the officer and the man, as if he could sense that something important had just been interrupted. The woman straightened slightly, her face tightening with concern, clearly waiting for the officer to explain why he stepped in at that exact moment. The officer who had received the radio message leaned closer to his partner and spoke in a low voice. Their conversation was quick but intense. I couldn't hear their words, but their body language made it obvious that new information had just changed the situation. The officer with the medical bag stood up slowly, looking between the man and the woman, like he was unsure whether to continue checking on the man's health or step back entirely. The flashing lights from the vehicles reflected across everyone's faces, making every expression look sharper, more dramatic, and impossible to ignore. The man lowered his eyes for a brief second after being stopped. He still clutched the photograph tightly in his hand, his fingers pressing into it like it was the only thing keeping him steady. The boy leaned forward slightly, clearly wanting to hear whatever the man had almost said. His curiosity was obvious, but there was also nervousness in the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The woman gently placed her arm around him again, pulling him just a little closer to her side, as if preparing for something unpredictable. The officer who had first spoken to me turned toward the woman and asked her a few more questions, this time with a slightly more serious tone. She nodded slowly while answering, occasionally glancing at the man. Her voice appeared shaky and she paused more than once, like she was choosing her words carefully. The boy looked up at her several times as if trying to understand the meaning behind her responses. The connection between them felt strong, protective, and emotional, but also filled with tension that none of them seemed ready to release. Meanwhile, the man shifted slightly on the ground, adjusting the blanket around his shoulders. The wind picked up again, carrying a chill that made him cough once more. The officer with the medical bag instinctively stepped closer, asking if he needed help standing or moving somewhere warmer. The man shook his head gently, still calm but clearly exhausted. He glanced at the boy again, his eyes softening, almost pleading, but he remained silent, as if he was waiting for permission to speak. The crowd watching from a distance had grown larger. Some people whispered to each other, guessing what might be happening. Others simply stood quietly, drawn into the moment without fully understanding why it felt so important. I noticed a few customers stepping out of the store and stopping mid-walk when they realized something serious was unfolding near the entrance. The store manager hovered near the doorway, occasionally speaking to an employee but keeping his eyes fixed on the group outside. Inside my car, I felt completely frozen, unable to look away. My earlier decision to ignore the man kept replaying in my mind, but now it felt like such a small part of something much bigger. I kept wondering about the photograph, about why it had caused such a strong reaction from the officers, and about how the woman and the boy seemed connected to him in a way that was still unclear. Every second stretched longer, like time itself was holding its breath. One of the officers suddenly asked the man if he would be willing to stand and move closer to the police vehicle so they could talk more privately. The request was calm and respectful, but it carried a sense of urgency that made everyone around them tense up. The man hesitated. His eyes moved quickly between the boy, the woman, and the officers, like he was trying to decide what mattered most in that moment. The photograph remained clutched in his hand, slightly bent now from how tightly he held it. The boy took a small step forward again, almost unconsciously, like he didn't want the man to move away. The woman noticed and gently placed her hand on his shoulder, but she didn't pull him back this time. Her eyes stayed locked on the man, filled with emotion that seemed to be growing harder for her to hide. The officers waited patiently, but their posture suggested they couldn't wait forever. Rain began falling harder again, tapping loudly against the metal surfaces of the vehicles and the roof of the store entrance. The sound created a strange rhythm around the group, making their quiet conversation feel even more intense. The man slowly tried to push himself up using one hand while still holding the photograph in the other. One of the officers reached out to support him, helping him stand carefully. His legs seemed unsteady and for a moment, it looked like he might lose his balance. As he stood, the blanket slipped slightly from his shoulders, revealing just how thin and worn his clothing was. The officer quickly helped adjust it again, making sure he stayed covered from the cold. The man nodded in quiet gratitude, but his eyes never left the boy. The distance between them felt charged with emotions that no one had put into words yet. The officer gestured gently toward the police vehicle, and the man took one slow step forward. The boy reacted instantly, stepping forward as well, his face showing sudden panic, like he was afraid the man might disappear if he moved too far away. The woman called his name softly, her voice trembling as she reached for him. The officers exchanged quick glances, clearly aware that separating them might make the situation more emotional. The man paused mid-step. He looked at the officers, then at the boy and finally down at the photograph in his hand. His breathing became slightly heavier, and for the first time his calm expression showed visible struggle, like he was caught between following instructions and staying where he felt he needed to be. The officer closest to him spoke gently, reassuring him that they just needed to ask a few more questions, but his tone carried a seriousness that suggested there was more happening behind the scenes. The boy suddenly spoke, his voice faint but clear enough to cut through the rain and silence around them. Everyone froze for a moment, including the officers. The man's head lifted slowly, his eyes widening as he focused entirely on the boy's face. The woman closed her eyes briefly, like she had been expecting this moment but still wasn't ready for it. Before anyone could respond, the officer's radio crackled loudly again, delivering another urgent message that made both officers turn toward each other with expressions that instantly raised the tension even higher, and the man's grip on the photograph tightened as he realized whatever was about to happen next could change everything. The loud crackle from the officer's radio cut through the rain like a sharp warning. Both officers listened carefully, their expressions shifting from concern to something far more serious. The one standing closest to the man stepped slightly aside, pressing his hand against the radio to hear more clearly. The other officer scanned the parking lot again, this time slower, more alert, like he was searching for something or someone. The sudden change in their body language made the tension around the store entrance feel almost suffocating. The man noticed it too. His shoulders stiffened, and his breathing grew uneven. He looked toward the boy again, his eyes filled with urgency now, not just emotion. The photograph trembled slightly in his hand as he held it closer to his chest. The boy stood frozen, his small voice still hanging in the air from when he had spoken seconds earlier. The woman crouched beside him, whispering something to calm him down, but her own eyes kept drifting toward the officers, trying to read their reactions. The officer finally lowered his radio and walked back toward the group. His face carried a tight seriousness that made the crowd fall quieter without being asked. He spoke briefly to his partner, his voice low but urgent. The second officer nodded and then turned toward the man, his tone still calm but now more direct. He asked the man where he had been earlier that day and if he had spoken to anyone else around the neighborhood. The question sounded simple, but the way it was asked made it feel heavy with meaning. The man hesitated before answering. He glanced toward the woman and the boy again, as if weighing how much he should say in front of them. His voice was quiet and he spoke slowly, explaining that he had spent most of the day near different shops, just trying to stay dry and warm. He mentioned sitting outside another store earlier but didn't go into detail. The officer listened carefully, occasionally glancing toward his partner as if silently confirming something they had just heard through the radio. The woman suddenly spoke, asking if something had happened nearby. Her voice was polite but filled with worry she couldn't hide anymore. The officers exchanged another look before one of them answered carefully, explaining that they had received a report connected to someone matching the man's description. The moment those words left his mouth, the atmosphere shifted again. The small crowd leaned in slightly, curiosity growing stronger, while the boy looked up at the man with confusion and fear mixing in his expression. The man's face dropped for just a second before he forced himself to stay calm. He shook his head gently, repeating that he hadn't done anything wrong. His voice wasn't defensive, just tired, like he had been misunderstood too many times before. He lifted the photograph slightly, almost like it was proof of something, though he didn't explain what it meant. The officer raised his hand gently, signaling that he wasn't accusing him of anything, but the seriousness in his eyes suggested they still needed answers. Inside my car, I felt my chest tighten. The story unfolding in front of me was becoming more complicated than anything I had imagined when I first stepped out of the store. The idea that the man might somehow be connected to another situation made everything feel unstable. I kept thinking about how easily people jump to conclusions when they see someone asking for money, and now I could feel that same tension building in the crowd around him. The boy suddenly stepped closer again, ignoring the woman's attempt to hold him back. He stared directly at the man and asked him a quiet but emotional question that made everyone freeze. His voice trembled as he asked if the photograph the man was holding had been taken at a place he recognized. The man's eyes widened instantly. He looked down at the photograph, then back at the boy, his lips parting slightly as if he was about to confirm something he had been holding inside for years. Before he could answer, one of the officers received another update through his radio. This time his reaction was sharper. He turned toward the parking lot entrance, scanning the street beyond the flashing lights. The distant sound of tires splashing through wet pavement echoed closer, and a dark vehicle slowed near the edge of the lot without fully pulling in. The officer's posture stiffened, and he quietly signaled his partner, who immediately stepped a little closer to the man and the woman, as if preparing for something unpredictable. The crowd began murmuring again, sensing the shift in energy. The woman followed the officer's gaze toward the vehicle, her face tightening with unease. The boy noticed it too, turning his head slowly toward the same direction. The man, still holding the photograph tightly, seemed to recognize something before anyone else did. His breathing grew heavier, and he took a small step backward, his calm expression cracking into visible fear for the first time. The officer standing beside him noticed the reaction immediately and asked him what was wrong. The man didn't answer right away. His eyes remained locked on the dark vehicle, which had now stopped completely near the entrance of the parking lot. Its headlights cut through the rain, making it difficult to see inside, but the silhouette of someone sitting in the driver's seat was barely visible. The woman instinctively pulled the boy closer to her side, her protective grip tightening. She whispered something urgently to him, her voice shaking. The officers shifted their positions slightly, placing themselves between the man and the direction of the vehicle without making it look obvious. The air felt electric, like everyone was waiting for the next move, but no one wanted to be the first to react. The man suddenly lowered the photograph, his hands trembling more noticeably now. He whispered something to the officer closest to him, something so quiet that even the officer had to lean in to hear. The officer's eyes widened slightly after listening, and he quickly glanced toward his partner again. The tension between them became obvious, like they had just been handed information that raised the stakes far higher than before. The vehicle's engine remained running, its headlights reflecting off the puddles, creating a blinding glare across the parking lot. The silhouette inside shifted slightly, as if the person behind the wheel was watching everything unfold. The crowd grew restless, a few people slowly stepping farther back, sensing that the situation was becoming more serious than they had expected. The boy looked back at the man, his voice barely above a whisper as he asked another question, one that made the woman close her eyes briefly, like she was afraid of the answer. The man's lips trembled as he tried to respond, his eyes filled with emotion and fear colliding all at once. Just as he opened his mouth to speak, the dark vehicle's door suddenly cracked open, and one of the officers reached toward his radio again, his expression turning sharp as he prepared for whatever was about to step out into the rain. The car door opened slowly, creaking under the steady rain, and every single person near the store entrance froze. Even the distant sound of traffic seemed to fade into the background. A tall man stepped out from the vehicle, holding an umbrella that barely shielded him from the heavy downpour. His face wasn't fully visible at first because of the bright headlights behind him, but his posture was stiff, confident, and purposeful. The officers immediately straightened, their attention fully locked onto him. The man sitting under the blanket took another step backward, his fear now impossible to hide. As the stranger walked closer, the store lights finally illuminated his face. He looked well-dressed, calm, and completely out of place in the storm and the tents gathering around the entrance. The woman gasped softly beside the boy, her hand tightening around his shoulder. The boy stared at the newcomer with confusion, clearly trying to recognize him. The officer stepped forward slightly, meeting the stranger halfway, asking him to stop right there. The man with the umbrella obeyed but kept his eyes locked on the man standing beside them. The stranger spoke calmly, introducing himself and saying he had been looking for the man for several days. His voice carried authority but also urgency, like he had been racing against time. The officers exchanged glances before asking how he knew him. The stranger reached into his coat pocket and carefully pulled out a folded document, protecting it from the rain. He explained that he had received a call earlier that evening after someone reported seeing a man matching this description outside multiple stores, carrying a photograph connected to a missing person case from years ago. The crowd murmured louder, the words "missing person" spreading like electricity through the people watching. The boy's eyes widened and he looked back at the man with the blanket, waiting, searching for answers he didn't even fully understand. The woman's face turned pale and she slowly crouched closer to the boy, whispering something that made his expression shift from confusion to shock. The officers turned toward the man, their expressions now more focused than ever. One of them gently asked him to explain the photograph and how it was connected to the case being mentioned. The man's hands trembled as he held the photograph up, his fingers struggling to keep it steady. He stared at it for a long moment, like he was gathering the courage to finally speak the truth he had been carrying alone for years. His voice came out rough and emotional as he began explaining that the photograph was taken many years ago, long before he ended up on the streets, long before life pushed him into asking strangers for spare money just to survive. He explained that the photo showed a small family, a woman, a young child, and himself, taken on a day when everything still felt normal and safe. The rain fell harder around them as he spoke, but no one moved, no one interrupted. Every person standing there leaned closer, drawn into the story unfolding in front of them. He admitted that he had lost contact with them during a series of devastating personal struggles, including losing his job, his home, and eventually his ability to stay connected to the people he loved most. His voice cracked as he explained how he spent years trying to find them again, carrying the photograph as the only reminder of who he used to be. He said he never stopped searching, never stopped hoping that one day he might see them again, even if it was just by chance outside a random store or on a crowded street. The boy suddenly stepped forward again, his eyes filling with tears he didn't try to hide. The woman reached for him but stopped halfway, her own emotions overwhelming her. The boy looked directly at the man and whispered a single word that made the man's knees nearly give out beneath him. The officers instinctively reached out to steady him as the reality of the moment hit all of them at once. The woman slowly stepped forward too, her eyes locked onto the man's face. She spoke his name softly, almost like she was afraid saying it out loud would break the moment. The man's expression shattered into raw emotion as he realized who was standing in front of him. The years of distance, pain, and unanswered questions collided in that single moment. The boy ran toward him, stopping just short, hesitating for a fraction of a second before the man reached out with shaking arms. The officer stepped back, giving them space as the emotional reunion unfolded in the rain. The crowd fell silent, witnessing something deeply personal and powerful. The woman wiped tears from her face as she watched the boy and the man finally embrace, both of them clinging to each other like they were afraid time might pull them apart again. The photograph slipped slightly from the man's hand but remained caught between them, pressed against their shoulders. The stranger with the umbrella stepped closer, explaining that he had been working privately on the missing person case for years after the family had reported the man missing, believing he might never be found. He revealed that earlier reports about someone matching the man's description had finally led him to the neighborhood. He confirmed that the woman and the boy had never stopped searching either, but they had no way of knowing he was still alive or where to look. The officers relaxed slightly, their serious posture softening as the truth became clear. One of them quietly spoke into his radio, confirming that the situation was safe and that no further emergency response was needed. The store manager stood silently near the entrance, his earlier frustration completely replaced by quiet disbelief. I sat in my car, overwhelmed by what I had just witnessed. The guilt I felt earlier had now turned into something deeper. A powerful realization of how easily people judge someone asking for help without knowing the life they once had or the battles they were still fighting. The man I had refused minutes earlier wasn't just someone asking strangers for money. He was someone who had lost everything and spent years trying to rebuild a broken connection with the people he loved. As the rain slowly began to lighten, the officer spoke quietly with the family, explaining that they would still need to confirm a few details to officially close the old case. The officer held the document carefully, shielding it from the last drops of rain as he read it again, slower this time. His partner leaned closer, both of them speaking in quiet voices that carried just enough tension to be noticed. The stranger with the umbrella stood still beside them, his calm expression now mixed with hesitation, like he wasn't sure how this new information would affect everything that had just happened. A few feet away, the reunited family remained locked in their emotional moment, unaware that another wave of uncertainty was quietly forming behind them. The officer finally stepped forward toward the man, his voice gentle but serious. He apologized for interrupting such an important moment but explained that they needed to confirm something that had just appeared in older case records. The man slowly loosened his embrace, his arms still protectively around the boy, while the woman stepped closer, her expression shifting from relief to worry. The man nodded, showing he was ready to listen, even though his eyes clearly feared what might come next. The officer explained that, according to records, the missing person case had included one more detail that had never been fully verified. There had been a report suggesting the man may have left suddenly while trying to protect his family from financial trouble and personal struggles that had grown overwhelming at the time. There were also records showing that the family had spent years searching for him, but there had been confusion caused by incorrect sightings and lost communication. The officer paused, choosing his next words carefully, making sure not to create unnecessary fear. He continued by explaining that the new documents simply confirmed that the case had remained open longer than anyone realized because authorities were never able to confirm whether the man had left willingly or had faced other circumstances. The stranger with the umbrella stepped forward and clarified that his involvement had always been about finding the truth and helping reunite families separated by difficult situations, not about placing blame or reopening painful wounds. The tension in the man's face slowly softened as he listened. He explained, with honesty and visible emotion, that he had left during one of the darkest periods of his life. He admitted he had believed his family would be safer and happier without the struggles he was facing at the time. His voice cracked as he spoke about how deeply he regretted that decision every single day afterward. He explained that pride, shame, and fear had stopped him from reaching out, and as the years passed, It became harder and harder to believe he deserved a second chance. The woman's eyes filled with tears as she listened. She stepped closer, her voice shaking but steady enough to be heard. She told him that the years without answers had been painful, but they had never stopped hoping he was alive. She explained how she had raised their child while holding on to memories and stories about him, making sure the boy would know who his father was, even without knowing where he had gone. The boy looked between them, absorbing every word like pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. The officers quietly stepped back again, giving them space while still ensuring everything remained safe and respectful. The stranger folded the document and handed it to the officer, confirming that, from his perspective, the case had finally reached the closure everyone had hoped for. He explained that his job wasn't just about solving mysteries but about helping people reconnect with their past so they could rebuild their future. The man knelt down slowly in front of the boy, his hands still trembling slightly as he held the photograph between them. He apologized in a voice that barely rose above a whisper, admitting he had missed birthdays, milestones, and years he could never get back. The boy listened quietly, tears rolling down his face, but when the man finished speaking, the boy stepped forward and hugged him tightly, showing forgiveness in a way words never could. The woman joined them, wrapping her arms around both of them, and for a long moment, none of them spoke. The rain had nearly stopped now, leaving only small drops falling from the store's roof and the sound of distant traffic returning to normal. The flashing police lights reflected across the wet pavement, but the tension that had filled the air earlier was slowly fading into something calmer, warmer, and deeply human. The store manager quietly approached, offering warm drinks and a place inside to sit and talk without the cold wind. The officers helped guide them toward the entrance, making sure the man had support while walking. The stranger with the umbrella gave a small respectful nod before stepping back toward his vehicle, his role in the story quietly complete. Before leaving, he handed the man a small card, encouraging him to reach out if he ever needed help rebuilding his life or reconnecting with resources that could support him and his family moving forward. Inside my car, I realized I had been holding onto the steering wheel for so long that my fingers felt stiff. I watched as the family disappeared inside the store, surrounded by quiet support and understanding. The officers followed shortly after, their job shifting from investigation to simple kindness. The parking lot, once filled with tension, slowly returned to normal as people left, carrying with them the memory of something they never expected to witness. I sat there for another moment, thinking about how quickly we form judgments when we see someone asking strangers for spare money. It's easy to assume we understand their story, easy to believe they are defined by the moment we see them. But what I had just witnessed reminded me that every person carries a life full of chapters we know nothing about. The man outside that store wasn't just someone experiencing homelessness. He was a father, a partner, and someone who had been fighting quietly to reconnect with the people he loved. I reached into my wallet, staring at the same crumpled bills I had refused to give earlier. The money felt heavier now, not because of its value but because of what it represented: missed opportunities to show compassion, moments where kindness could have been easier than judgment. I knew I couldn't change the choice I had made earlier that evening, but I also knew I could carry the lesson forward. Eventually, I started my car and pulled out of the parking lot, the wet streets reflecting the fading store lights behind me. As I drove home, my mind replayed the entire night, from the moment I walked past the man to the emotional reunion that followed. The experience stayed with me, reminding me that sometimes the smallest decisions, whether to stop, to listen, or to show kindness, can connect us to stories far bigger than we realize. Life moves fast and we all carry struggles others can't see. Some people are searching for help. Others are searching for forgiveness, connection, or simply a second chance. That night taught me that refusing to help someone might seem small in the moment, but every encounter holds the possibility of changing a life, including our own.